The forest to the north of the small village of Monasteria was known for its untouched beauty and its mysteries. Ancient trees stood tall like old colossi, their leaves forming a golden-green veil that danced with the wind. You could hear the distant song of birds, and at night, the howls of wolves echoed, reminding the villagers that here, nature still reigned supreme. No one ventured far beyond the first clearings. It was said that the forest did not forgive those who dared to challenge it. In this setting, we meet our protagonist, Joaquim, a man in his early 60s, living in solitude since his wife Marina had passed away a few years before. He lived in a simple cabin on the edge of the forest, leading a quiet life, spending his days collecting and selling firewood to the village. Joaquim's life was like the trees he cut, tough but silent. The memories of Marina were his only comfort. He had slowly withdrawn from the world, his days blending into a monotonous routine, without great emotions, without hope for change. Joaquim had always been a man of few words, but with a big heart. His eyes, weary from time and loss, still carried a spark of kindness. He was known in the village as the old man of the forest, someone who, despite his silence, everyone respected for his quiet generosity. His monotonous routine distanced him from the rest of the world, but that didn't bother him. He felt comfortable in his isolation, believing that nothing could touch his heart anymore, until the day everything changed. On a cold autumn afternoon, Joaquim went into the forest to gather firewood before the harsh winter arrived. The wind blew icy between the branches, and the cloudy sky threatened a storm. He walked farther than usual, his footsteps echoing on the ground covered with dry leaves. That's when he heard it. A distant sound, almost imperceptible at first, but gradually intensifying. A low whimper, followed by a pained moan. Concerned and curious, Joaquim followed the sound to a hidden clearing. And there he saw it for the first time, a young wolf, trapped in an illegal hunter's snare, struggling to break free. The animal was majestic, with silver-gray fur and intense yellow eyes that glowed with fear and pain. Joaquim froze for a moment, unable to believe what he was seeing. He knew the stories of wolves in the region, but he never imagined he would be so close to one, especially in such a condition. The wolf desperately tried to free its front paw, which was caught in the trap. The metal bit into its flesh, and blood had already stained the ground around it. Despite the visible pain, the animal showed no signs of giving up, and this deeply touched Joaquim's heart. He knew that if he left the wolf there, it would die within hours, either from blood loss or when the hunters returned for their prey. Despite the danger of approaching a wild, injured animal, Joaquim didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. His steps were slow and careful, trying to show the wolf that he was not a threat. The wolf growled softly when Joaquim knelt beside it, but the pain seemed to outweigh any urge to attack. Joaquim, with his hands skilled from years of working with wood, used a tool he always carried to force open the trap. The metal gave way with a snap, and the wolf, despite its pain, jumped back slightly, trying to move away, but its strength betrayed it. Joaquim watched as the animal now stared at him with those deep eyes. For what seemed like an eternity, they both remained still, as if one understood the other. Without saying a word, Joaquim stood up and calmly started walking back home, certain that the wolf would flee. But to his surprise, the animal followed, keeping a safe distance but always within sight. When he reached home, Joaquim realized the wolf hadn't left. It lingered, hiding in the shadows of the trees near the cabin. For days, the wolf stayed close, watching Joaquim from afar, but always close enough for him to know it was still there. There was something special about that silent connection. They were two lost souls, wounded by the world, who somehow found solace in each other's presence. And so, slowly, the wolf began to trust Joaquim. The man left small pieces of meat outside his cabin, and the wolf devoured them under the light of the moon. It was as if an old debt was being repaid. Joaquim had saved the wolf's life, and in some way, the wolf was determined not to abandon him. The unlikely friendship between a lonely man and a wild wolf began to grow, but Joaquim had no idea that fate was about to place them in a situation that would change their lives forever. The cold autumn days began giving way to a harsh winter, and Joaquim's cabin became a refuge from the thick snow that piled up rapidly. The wolf, which had once kept its distance, now stayed closer, even lying near the door as if guarding the entrance to the house. Joaquim, for his part, had grown accustomed to the animal's presence and, in a way, found strange companionship in this creature that, like him, also seemed to bear the scars of the world. But in that mysterious forest, danger did not come only from the cold or from illegal hunters. Joaquim began to feel the effects of a strange weakness. The daily work of chopping wood and carrying heavy loads, which he had once done with ease, now felt like an enormous effort. His body ached more than usual, and a dry cough started to trouble him, especially at night. At first, he ignored the signs, thinking it was just the toll of the harsh winter. But as the days passed, his health worsened. One day, Joaquim went out to collect firewood near the cabin, as he always did. He felt weaker than ever, but he forced himself to continue his routine. The wolf followed him closely, as if sensing something was wrong. When Joaquim raised his axe to chop a small tree, his body gave out. He collapsed to his knees, the axe slipping from his hands, and a violent cough erupted from his chest. He could barely breathe. His vision began to darken, and for a brief moment, Joaquim thought this was the end, here, alone in the forest. But he was not alone. The wolf immediately approached, howling, as if calling for help, though there was no one around to hear. The animal's intense yellow eyes were fixed on Joaquim, as if it knew what was happening. With tremendous effort, Joaquim managed to get to his feet, using the axe for support, and slowly began to walk back to the house, the wolf by his side, watching every step. Each yard covered felt longer than the last, and his strength was rapidly fading. Finally, upon reaching the cabin door, Joaquim collapsed in the doorway. The wolf stayed at his side, restless, as though fully aware of the gravity of the situation. Joaquim, still conscious, crawled inside and managed to close the door with great difficulty. He collapsed beside the fireplace, gasping for breath, while the wolf kept watch by the window, as if standing guard. In the days that followed, Joaquim's health deteriorated further. He could barely get out of bed, a fever burning through his body, and the cough intensified, leaving him too weak to even get up to eat. The wolf, now closer than ever, stayed by the door, howling each night, as though calling for something that even Joaquim couldn't understand. The loneliness that had once been his choice now became a heavy burden. For the first time in years, he felt truly vulnerable, without the strength to fight. On one of those long nights, while Joaquim lay feverish and delirious, something unexpected happened. The cabin door, which he had left poorly closed, creaked open. Cold wind rushed in, but what Joaquim saw in his half-conscious state was the wolf entering the cabin. Its steps were quiet, almost as if it didn't want to disturb the sick man. The wolf approached the bed and lay down next to him, as if it knew that its presence was the only comfort Joaquim had left. The nights passed like this, with the wolf lying by the bed while Joaquim fought against the fever. Between bouts of delirium, he remembered Marina, how she used to care for him in hard times, how her soft hand would touch his forehead when he was ill. Now, the touch was cold. The warmth came only from the wild beast lying next to him. But the worst night was yet to come. It was a freezing night. Snow had piled up in thick layers outside, and the wind howled through the trees like a mournful symphony. Joaquim could barely open his eyes, his mind lost in a haze of pain and exhaustion. That's when he heard the sound. It wasn't the wind, nor the dry cough that tore at his throat. It was a subtle but dangerous noise. Footsteps. Human footsteps, crushing the snow outside the cabin. Joaquim tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. The wolf, however, was alert. From its position by the fireplace, it raised its head and began to growl softly, its eyes fixed on the door. Joaquim, feverish, felt a chill that didn't come from the illness, but from fear. He knew what was happening. The hunters, the ones who had set the trap for the wolf, they had returned. A loud crack sounded from outside, and the cabin door was violently kicked open. 3 men entered, their clothes dirty with snow and mud, their faces hidden under hoods. They carried rifles, and their eyes scanned the small room until they landed on Joaquim's frail body, lying in bed. But what they hadn't expected was the wolf. The animal, which had seemed calm, leaped at the first intruder with a fury only a wild creature could possess. Its teeth gleamed in the firelight as it attacked the man, knocking him to the ground. The other 2 men shouted in shock, and a gunshot rang out through the cabin. Joaquim, in his weakened state, watched the scene with horror and disbelief. The wolf he had saved was now fighting for his life. The gunshot echoed through the small cabin, cutting through the cold, dense air like a sharp blade. Joaquim, even weak and almost unable to move, felt his heart race as he saw the wolf launch itself at the first intruder. The man who fell to the ground let out a muffled scream, fighting to free himself from the sharp claws tearing at his skin. The wolf was a blur of fury and instinct, its mouth open, revealing teeth gleaming in the flickering light of the fireplace. The other 2 men hesitated for a moment, shocked by the ferocity of the animal. One of them raised his rifle again, aiming hastily at the wolf, but panic had clouded his vision. The next shot barely missed the wolf, hitting the wooden wall behind it, sending splinters flying. But that wasn't enough to stop the wolf. It turned with impressive speed, its paws moving with the precision of a predator that knew the fight was a matter of life or death. Meanwhile, Joaquim watched in a mixture of terror and gratitude. His breathing was labored, his body immobilized by fever, but his mind, though foggy, understood what was happening. The wolf, the wild and solitary creature he had rescued, was now risking its own life to protect him. The animal he had saved from the cruel fate of a trap was repaying the gesture in unimaginable ways. The wolf leaped at the second man, the tallest and strongest of the 3, and this time the impact was devastating. The rifle slipped from his hands as he tried to defend himself, but the animal's strength overpowered him. He fell heavily to the ground, and the wolf sank its teeth into his arm. Cries of pain filled the air, and the third man, the only one still standing, finally retreated, fear written all over his face. "Run!" he shouted to the others, his voice trembling with fear. But before he could flee, the wolf turned toward him, growling so menacingly that the man stumbled backward, falling into the thick snow at the entrance to the cabin. His wide eyes met Joaquim's for a brief moment, and he saw something in the old man's face that he hadn't expected, a fierce calm, as if Joaquim knew that the forest, at that moment, was on his side. With his heart pounding and his body refusing to cooperate, the third man scrambled across the ground until he managed to get up and run, disappearing quickly among the snow-covered trees. The wolf, satisfied with chasing him off, didn't pursue. Instead, it turned back toward the other 2 invaders, who now lay seriously wounded. The first man, who had taken the initial attack, was already unconscious, bleeding heavily. The second, with his bitten arm, was trying to crawl toward the door, but the wolf positioned itself between him and the exit, emitting a low, constant growl, a clear warning. The adrenaline from the fight began to fade, and Joaquim, still lying in bed, felt exhaustion wash over him once again. But something was different. Contrary to what he had expected, his mind was strangely clear. He could fully grasp the depth of what had just occurred. The wolf, the creature that everyone in the village feared, had risked its life to save him. And he, a simple man who could barely protect himself, had found in a wild creature the protection he never would have imagined. For a few moments, silence reigned in the cabin. Only the sound of the wind outside and Joaquim's heavy breathing filled the air. The wolf, now calm, walked toward the bed, its yellow eyes meeting Joaquim's. The man, with difficulty, raised a hand, extending it slowly. The wolf approached even more until its nose touched Joaquim's palm. In that subtle touch between man and beast, there was a silent understanding, something that transcended words. But time wasn't waiting. Joaquim's fever was worsening, and he knew that if he didn't do something quickly, he wouldn't survive. With tremendous effort, he managed to sit up in bed, his body trembling with the strain. His eyes fell on the two wounded men on the floor. They were no longer the biggest threat. The real enemy was inside him, the illness that was slowly consuming him. It was then that he made a crucial decision. Looking at the wolf, he whispered in a weak voice, "I need help. I need someone to save me." And as if fully understanding what Joaquim was saying, the wolf stepped back, watching him intently for a few seconds. Then, in an agile movement, it slipped out the partially open door and disappeared into the cold night. Joaquim, still trembling, stared into the darkness, unsure if the wolf would return, but with a small hope growing in his heart. He knew the animal had a keen instinct and, somehow, could do something for him. The hours passed slowly. Joaquim clung to life, his body fighting against the fever that ravaged him. He barely knew if he was dreaming or awake, but at some point, he heard the sound of footsteps outside the cabin again. This time, it wasn't the threatening sound of heavy boots in the snow, but something softer, accompanied by a familiar breath. The wolf had returned. And it wasn't alone. A woman's figure appeared at the door. It was Elena, a villager who had spent her entire life caring for sick and injured animals. The wolf had led her there, as if it knew exactly who could help its human friend. Without wasting time, she rushed to Joaquim's side. Her eyes filled with concern as she saw the state he was in. With skill and speed, she began treating him, applying cold compresses and giving him medicines she carried in her bag of herbs. As Elena worked, the wolf remained by the door, like a silent guardian, ensuring that this time, no one would threaten its friend again. The days that followed were ones of recovery and reflection. Elena's swift intervention had saved Joaquim's life, but it wasn't just the medicine that pulled him back from the edge. During the moments when he was between life and death, the constant presence of the wolf, who guarded the cabin day and night, was a silent reminder that he wasn't alone. That creature, once a symbol of the forest's fear and wildness, had now become his protector. Elena cared for Joaquim with all the skills she had acquired over the years. Her hands were firm but gentle, and she knew exactly what to do to combat the fever and soothe Joaquim's inflamed lungs. During the cold nights, she brewed herbal teas to help clear his breathing and applied warm compresses to his chest while the wolf stayed silent by the fireplace, alert to every movement. As Joaquim slowly began to recover, his thoughts turned to what had happened. The memories of the night the hunters invaded his home were fresh in his mind, but what impacted him the most was the bravery of the wolf. It was hard to believe that an animal, raised in the depths of the forest, had formed such a deep connection with him. The two of them had crossed an invisible boundary, something that transcended the natural relationship between man and animal. And now, Joaquim felt that his life was linked to the wolf's in a way he could never have imagined. That same week, when Joaquim was finally able to stand, albeit with some difficulty, Elena returned to the village to gather more supplies. For the first time since the incident, Joaquim found himself alone with the wolf. The animal, sensing that Joaquim was stronger, approached him calmly, and they exchanged a gaze, just as they had the night of the rescue. Joaquim, still with a weak voice, spoke, more to himself than to the animal. "You saved my life, just as I saved yours. I guess we're even, my friend." The wolf only stared at him, its ears twitching slightly at the distant sound of the wind blowing through the trees. There was an uncommon peace in that moment. It was as if time had stopped for a while, and Joaquim realized that, in some profound way, the animal understood every word he said. In that silence, he perceived something deeper. Both were lonely creatures, surviving in a world that was not always kind, but now, somehow, they had found comfort in each other's presence. The days continued to pass, and with time, Joaquim began to fully recover. The fever was gone, and the strength in his arms and legs gradually returned. He could now go outside to gather firewood, and although his movements were still slow, he was determined to resume his life. The wolf's presence at his side gave him a sense of security that he had never felt before. Meanwhile, the two men wounded during the attack were taken to the village by Elena to receive the medical care they needed. After the confrontation with the wolf, they were weak and shaken, both physically and emotionally. That encounter had changed their lives forever. They would never return to hunt in that forest, not after experiencing firsthand the relentless strength of an animal defending its territory, and, surprisingly, a man who they never would have expected to be protected by a beast. Joaquim, who had always been a discreet man, never expected that the story of his recovery and the wolf would spread so quickly through the village. People, initially skeptical, began hearing the accounts from Elena and the hunters. Soon, the legend of the old man and the wolf began circulating among the villagers. The elders spoke about it with reverence, marveling at the inexplicable bond between man and animal, while the younger ones told the story as if it were a fairy tale, something that defied logic and the understanding of the natural world. However, Joaquim's relationship with the wolf remained simple and quiet. He never tried to tame the animal or treat it like a pet. He knew the wolf was a free, wild creature, and its place was in the forest. But at the same time, there was a mutual understanding between them. The wolf continued to return to the cabin, even though it had the freedom to roam the vastness of the forest. It walked alongside Joaquim when he went out to chop wood, and sometimes disappeared for days, only to return, as if it knew that its place was here. As the months passed, Joaquim realized that his life, once marked by loneliness and a lack of purpose, was being transformed. The wolf had reintroduced something he thought he had lost forever, a sense of connection, of belonging to something greater than himself. And that brought him a new peace. He was no longer the old man of the forest, lonely and isolated, but someone who had discovered, through compassion for a wounded animal, that there was still much to live for, much to feel. However, life is not made up only of moments of calm. The news that illegal hunters were still roaming the region reached the ears of Joaquim and Elena. The men who had invaded his home were not the only ones. Others, less careful, continued setting traps in the forest, and this time, their target wasn't just animals, but anyone who dared to stand in their way. The tension in the village grew, and many began to avoid the depths of the forest. There was a sense of fear in the air, a foreboding that something was about to happen. But Joaquim wasn't intimidated. He knew he wasn't alone. He knew that by his side, he had an ally who knew no fear, someone who had fought for him once and, if necessary, would do it again. The wolf, silent and vigilant, was a symbol of strength and courage. And Joaquim, now with a new understanding of what it meant to have a second chance, decided that he would protect that forest, the home of both of them, at any cost. Winter finally gave way to spring, and as the snow melted, life returned to bloom around Joaquim's cabin. The trees were reborn, streams began to flow with vigor again, and birds filled the air with song. Joaquim, now fully recovered, watched this renewal with a rejuvenated heart. The wolf's presence continued, silent and constant, like a protective shadow that accompanied him at every step. The news of illegal hunters and the threat they posed to the forest still loomed over the village, but something had changed. The villagers, inspired by the story of Joaquim and the wolf, began to unite. No one wanted to live in fear of those who sought to destroy the harmony of nature. Led by Joaquim and Elena, the villagers organized patrols to protect the forest, reporting any signs of traps and alerting local authorities. The village, once silent and isolated, was now mobilized to defend what they considered sacred, the connection between man and nature. The wolf, once seen as a threat, became a symbol of resilience and loyalty. Joaquim knew that, despite being a wild creature, the wolf had chosen to stay by his side for a reason far deeper than simple survival instinct. It was living proof that, in moments of despair, the heart can find allies in the most unexpected places. One quiet afternoon, while Joaquim was chopping wood with the wolf watching from a distance, he realized something that made him stop for a moment. The loneliness he had felt for so many years after Marina's death no longer weighed on his shoulders. He had found a new reason to keep living, to keep fighting. The wolf, with its silent presence, had shown him that life, even in its darkest hours, could surprise in ways beyond explanation. That night, as he sat by the fireplace, Joaquim reflected on everything he had been through. The illness that nearly claimed him, the invaders who had tried to take his peace, and, above all, the wolf that had saved his life in ways he could never have imagined. It wasn't just a matter of physical survival. The wolf had saved him from something much deeper: hopelessness. And with that, Joaquim had found a new strength to live. He knew that life would continue to bring challenges, like the relentless cycle of the seasons. But he also knew that, just as spring always returned to the forest, hope could always be reborn. And as long as the wolf was by his side, he would never face those challenges alone. With one last look at the wolf, resting peacefully at the cabin's door, Joaquim smiled. The journey they had traveled together had been far from easy, but he now understood that some of life's greatest lessons come from the most unlikely connections. And as the fire crackled in the hearth, he closed his eyes, feeling the deep peace of someone who had finally found his place in the world, and his true friend.